In the autumn of 1872, three sisters vanished from their Kentucky farmstead on the same night, leaving behind only their nightgowns soaked in morning dew and a town that would never speak their names again. What happened to the Whitmore daughters remains buried in silence. Until now. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Bourbon County like a burial shroud, and Samuel Whitmore knew something was terribly wrong before he even reached the barn. October 13th, 1872, had dawned with an unnatural stillness that made the veteran farmer's weathered hands tremble as he pulled on his work boots. The Whitmore farm stretched across 200 acres of Kentucky's finest tobacco land, a prosperous spread that Samuel had carved from wilderness with his own sweat and determination. His three daughters, Margaret, 17, Catherine, 15, and young Sarah, barely 13, were the pride of his life and the envy of every family in nearby Millersburg. Beautiful, well-mannered, and blessed with their mother's gentle disposition, the Whitmore sisters were spoken of with reverence throughout the county. But on this particular morning, as Samuel approached the chicken coop expecting to find his daughters gathering eggs, as they had every day for years, he found only silence. The hens clucked nervously in their roosts, unfed and agitated. The milk cow lowed plaintively from the pasture, her udders full and aching. Most disturbing of all, the kitchen garden showed signs of disturbance, trampled earth and broken stalks that spoke of some midnight struggle. Samuel's wife, Eleanor, had been dead these past 2 years, taken by consumption during the harsh winter of 1870. Since then, his daughters had assumed the household duties with remarkable grace, rising before dawn to tend the animals and prepare breakfast. Never once had they failed in their responsibilities. Never once had they given him cause for worry. The farmhouse itself stood undisturbed, its white clapboard siding gleaming in the pale morning light. The front door remained latched from the inside, just as Samuel had left it the night before. But when he climbed the narrow stairs to check his daughters' bedrooms, his blood turned to ice water in his veins. Each bed was empty, the quilts thrown back as if the girls had risen in haste. Their nightgowns lay in neat piles on the floor, damp with morning dew despite being inside the house. Most peculiar of all, their day clothes remained untouched in the wooden wardrobes, suggesting the sisters had departed in a state of undress that defied all explanation. Samuel's shouts echoed through the empty rooms, his voice cracking with a desperation that would haunt him for the rest of his days. As he stumbled from room to room, searching for any clue to his daughter's whereabouts, one terrible certainty began to settle in his mind like frost on a window pane. The Whitmore sisters had vanished without a trace, and the silence that followed would consume an entire town. What force could compel three virtuous daughters to abandon their beds in the dead of night, leaving behind everything they held dear? By noon, every able-bodied man in Millersburg had joined the search for the Whitmore daughters. The news of their disappearance spread through the small Kentucky town like wildfire, carried by breathless messengers who rode from farm to farm with increasing urgency. Sheriff Thomas McKinnon, a grizzled Civil War veteran who had seen his share of mysteries, organized the men into systematic search parties that combed every inch of the surrounding countryside. The autumn landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, rolling hills covered in crimson and gold, dense woodlands where shadows played tricks on searching eyes, and countless hollows where three young girls could disappear forever. The searchers called out the sisters' names until their voices grew hoarse, the sound echoing off limestone cliffs and dying in the thick underbrush. Dr. Jeremiah Hastings, the town's physician and a close family friend, examined the Whitmore farmhouse with the methodical precision of a man trained in observation. The damp nightgowns troubled him most of all. How could fabric become saturated with dew while inside a closed house? He tested the windows and found them securely latched from within, the glass unbroken and showing no signs of forced entry. "It's as if they simply walked through the walls," Dr. Hastings murmured to Sheriff McKinnon, his usually steady hands shaking as he examined the mysterious garments. The fabric showed no tears, no bloodstains, no evidence of struggle, only that inexplicable dampness that defied rational explanation. The search parties discovered their first clue near sunset when young Timothy Fletcher found a single footprint in the soft earth beside Miller's Creek, half a mile south of the Whitmore property. The print was small and delicate, unmistakably feminine, pressed deep into the mud as if whoever made it had been running. But the trail ended there, at the water's edge, with no corresponding print on the opposite bank. More disturbing still were the reports from neighboring farms. The Hendersons mentioned that their dogs had howled incessantly between midnight and dawn, a mournful sound that had kept the entire family awake. The Buchanans reported that their horses had refused to be led from the stable that morning, rearing and whinnying with terror whenever they were brought near the barn door. As darkness fell on October the 13th, the search parties reluctantly returned to town empty-handed. Samuel Whitmore sat alone in his kitchen, staring at 3 untouched breakfast plates that would remain set at his table for months to come. Outside, the Kentucky hills held their secrets close, and somewhere in that vast wilderness, his sisters had vanished as completely as if they had never existed at all. Tell me in the comments, if you lived in this isolated farming community, would you have joined the search, or would the strange circumstances have made you bar your doors instead? The second night brought no rest to Millersburg. As word of the Whitmore sisters' disappearance spread beyond the county lines, a different kind of visitor began arriving in town, those drawn by whispers of the supernatural, carrying with them stories that made even hardened farmers cross themselves in the lamplight. Mrs. Abigail Thornton, the town's seamstress and keeper of local gossip, held court in her parlor as neighbors gathered to share what they had seen and heard. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper as she recounted the strange dreams that had plagued her sleep the night the sisters vanished. In her vision, she claimed, 3 figures in white had walked through the town square at the stroke of midnight, their feet never touching the cobblestones, their faces turned towards something terrible in the distance. They were moving like sleepwalkers, Mrs. Thornton insisted, her needle-worn fingers clutching a pewter cross. But their eyes, Lord help me, their eyes were wide open and filled with such sorrow that it near broke my heart to see it. Similar accounts emerged from other townspeople. The blacksmith, Jonas Miller, swore he had heard feminine voices singing hymns near the old cemetery, though when he investigated with his lantern, he found nothing but disturbed earth around several graves. The voices, he claimed, had been achingly beautiful but filled with a melancholy that made his very bones ache. More troubling were the reports from the town's children. Little Mary Patterson, only 8 years old, insisted she had seen 3 girls in white dresses playing in the church graveyard during her evening prayers. When her mother pressed for details, Mary could only sob that the girls had beckoned to her, their mouths moving as if calling her name, though no sound reached her ears. The local minister, Reverend Ezekiel Stone, found himself fielding increasingly desperate questions about matters far beyond his theological training. Could the dead return to reclaim the living? Were there forces in the world that could compel virtuous young women to abandon their earthly duties? His sermons had always focused on God's love and redemption, but now his congregation demanded answers about darker spiritual realms. As the third day dawned without any sign of the sisters, a terrible certainty began to settle over Millersburg like a pall. This was no ordinary disappearance, no simple case of runaways or foul play. Something else was at work in their quiet community, something that defied rational explanation and threatened to shatter their faith in the natural order of things. The autumn wind carried strange sounds through the streets that night, and more than one family would later swear they heard the distant sound of young women weeping, though the source remained forever hidden in the darkness. Do you believe in supernatural callings, or was something more sinister stalking these innocent sisters? Share your thoughts below. On the 4th morning, Reverend Ezekiel Stone made a discovery that would haunt him for the remainder of his earthly days. Rising before dawn for his customary walk through the church cemetery, a meditation he had practiced for nearly 20 years, the aging minister noticed something that stopped his heart cold in his chest. 3 graves in the oldest section of the burial ground, dating back to the cholera outbreak of 1854, showed clear signs of recent disturbance. The earth had been carefully removed and then replaced, but to Stone's experienced eye, the difference was unmistakable. Someone had been digging in the dead of night, working with methodical precision to uncover graves that had been undisturbed. For nearly 2 decades, The headstones told a tragic story that sent ice water flowing through the Reverend's veins. Margaret Sinclair, aged 17, Catherine Sinclair, aged 15, Sarah Sinclair, aged 13. 3 sisters who had perished within days of each other during the terrible plague that had claimed nearly a quarter of the town's population. 3 young women whose names bore an impossible similarity to the missing Whitmore daughters. With trembling hands, Reverend Stone examined the disturbed earth more closely. The digging had been done from within, as impossible as that seemed. Clods of dirt were scattered outward from each gravesite, and strange marks in the soil suggested something had clawed its way up from the depths below. Most disturbing of all, 3 sets of small footprints led away from the cemetery, heading directly toward the Whitmore farm. The Reverend's mind reeled as he tried to comprehend what he was seeing. In all his years of ministry, he had encountered grief and loss in countless forms, but never anything that challenged his understanding of life and death so fundamentally. The evidence before him suggested something that his rational mind rejected, even as his eyes confirmed its reality. Racing back to the parsonage, Stone rifled through the church records with desperate urgency. The burial logs from 1854 painted an even more disturbing picture. The Sinclair sisters had been the daughters of a tobacco farmer named Josiah Sinclair, whose property had been located exactly where the Whitmore farm now stood. The original homestead had burned to the ground during the cholera outbreak, taking the entire family with it, all except the 3 daughters, who had died days later in the town's makeshift hospital. As Stone studied the faded ink entries, one final detail made his blood freeze in his veins. According to the records, the Sinclair sisters had died on October the 13th, 1854, exactly 18 years to the day before the Whitmore daughters vanished from their beds. The connection was impossible to ignore, yet too terrible to accept. Had the dead somehow returned to reclaim their ancestral home? And if so, what did they want with 3 living sisters who bore their names and ages so precisely? That evening, as Sheriff McKinnon prepared to expand the search into neighboring counties, Samuel Whitmore appeared at his door with a confession that would shatter everything the lawman thought he knew about the case. The grief-stricken father stood on the sheriff's porch, his clothes disheveled and his eyes hollow with sleepless torment, clutching a bundle of yellowed documents against his chest. "I should have told the truth from the beginning," Samuel whispered, his voice barely audible above the autumn wind. "But I thought... God help me, I thought the past was buried deep enough to stay buried." Inside the sheriff's parlor, by the flickering light of oil lamps, Samuel spread out his terrible secret. The documents were land deeds, survey maps, and legal papers dating back to 1855, proof that he had purchased the Whitmore farm not from the territorial government, as he had always claimed, but from the estate of Josiah Sinclair, the tobacco farmer whose family had perished in the cholera outbreak. The price was too good to refuse, Samuel confessed, his weathered hands trembling as he pointed to figures written in faded ink. 200 acres of the finest farmland in Kentucky for half its value. The estate lawyers said no one else would bid on cursed ground, but I didn't believe in such nonsense. I thought it was just superstition. But there was more to Samuel's deception than simple opportunism. The documents revealed that he had not simply purchased the land, he had also removed every trace of the original Sinclair homestead. The foundation stones had been hauled away, the family cemetery relocated, and even the old apple orchard had been uprooted and replanted elsewhere. Samuel had built his new life quite literally on top of the old, erasing the Sinclair family's existence as completely as if they had never lived at all. "I wanted a fresh start for my family," he continued, tears streaming down his face. "Eleanor never knew the truth. The girls never knew. I thought if I could just forget what happened here, if I could make this land productive and happy again, then maybe the tragedy could be put to rest." Sheriff McKinnon studied the papers with growing unease. The surveyor's map showed the exact location of the original Sinclair house, and the measurements matched the Whitmore farmhouse perfectly. Samuel had built his family home on the precise spot where the Sinclair sisters had spent their final days, creating a terrible symmetry that now seemed to echo across the decades. "You think they came back for what was stolen from them?" McKinnon said quietly. It wasn't a question. Samuel nodded, his confession finally complete. I think my daughters are paying the price for my greed, and God forgive me, I don't know how to bring them home. What sins of the past demand payment in the present? Tell me in the comments. Do you believe in generational curses? Professor Ezra Whitman, the elderly historian who maintained Millersburg's records and archives, had spent 3 sleepless nights poring over every document related to the cholera outbreak of 1854. His small study, crammed with leather-bound ledgers and yellowing newspapers, had become a shrine to tragic memory as he uncovered details that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. The cholera had arrived in Millersburg during the late summer of 1854, brought by river travelers who had carried the disease up from New Orleans. What began as isolated cases of sickness quickly exploded into a full epidemic that overwhelmed the town's modest medical resources. The Sinclair farm, located on the outskirts of town, had seemed initially protected by its isolation until the disease struck with vengeful fury. According to contemporary accounts, the 3 Sinclair sisters had displayed remarkable devotion to their afflicted parents, refusing to flee when neighbors offered to take them to safety in distant counties. Instead, they had remained at their family's bedside, nursing their mother and father through their final agonizing days, while the farmhouse became a quarantine station cut off from the rest of the world. Their virtue was their downfall, Professor Whitman muttered to himself as he read from a diary kept by Dr. Marcus Webb, the town's physician during the outbreak. The girls could have saved themselves, but love bound them to that cursed place until it was too late. The newspaper accounts from October 1854 revealed even more chilling details. When the Sinclair parents finally succumbed to the disease, their daughters had insisted on preparing the bodies for burial themselves, despite warnings from town officials about the risk of infection. They had washed and dressed their parents with their own hands, sewn their burial shrouds, and even helped dig their graves in the small family cemetery behind the house. 3 days later, all 3 sisters had fallen ill simultaneously. Their symptoms, however, differed from typical cholera cases in ways that had puzzled Dr. Webb. Instead of the usual violent sickness, the girls had simply grown weaker and paler each day, as if some essential part of themselves was being slowly drained away. They spoke constantly of hearing their parents calling to them from beyond the grave, begging their daughters to join them in eternal rest. On October 13th, 1854, Margaret, Catherine, and Sarah Sinclair had died within hours of each other, their faces peaceful but their eyes wide open, staring towards something that only they could see. Dr. Webb's final entry about the case noted one detail that had troubled him for years afterward. When he closed their eyes for burial, they would not stay closed, as if the sisters were determined to keep watching for something in the world of the living. The parallel to the missing Whitmore daughters was impossible to ignore, and Professor Whitman felt the weight of terrible knowledge settling on his shoulders like a funeral shroud. As October deepened into its second week, the people of Millersburg began to experience phenomena that challenged their understanding of life and death. The incident started small, fleeting glimpses of white figures in peripheral vision, the sound of feminine laughter echoing from empty streets, and an inexplicable drop in temperature that made even warm houses feel cold as tombstones. Mrs. Eleanor Grayson, whose house stood directly across from the old Sinclair property line, was the first to report a direct encounter. Awakening from uneasy sleep on the night of October 18th, she had been drawn to her bedroom window by the sound of voices singing hymns in perfect harmony. Through the frost-covered glass, she witnessed 3 young women in white dresses standing in the middle of the road, their faces turned toward the Whitmore farmhouse with expressions of infinite longing. They were beautiful beyond description, Mrs. Grayson later told anyone willing to listen. But there was something wrong about them, something that made my very soul shiver. Their skin was pale as moonlight, and they moved with a grace that seemed to defy the laws of nature. When the tallest one turned to look at my window, I saw that her eyes held all the sorrow of the world. Similar sightings multiplied throughout the week. The town's children reported seeing three sisters playing in the cemetery during daylight hours, their laughter carrying an otherworldly quality that made adults cross themselves and hurry past. Shopkeepers found their windows fogged with condensation, and despite the dry autumn air, and some claimed to see messages written in the moisture, names, dates, and pleas for remembrance that faded before witnesses could be summoned. Most disturbing of all were the dreams that plagued nearly every household in Millersburg. Families reported identical nightmares in which the Sinclair sisters appeared at their bedsides, not threatening or malevolent, but filled with a desperate need to communicate something vital. In these visions, the three spirits would point toward the Whitmore farm and mouth words that dreamers could never quite understand, their faces etched with urgency and sorrow. The local doctor, overwhelmed by reports of insomnia and nervous exhaustion, began to suspect that the entire town was experiencing some form of collective hysteria. Yet even his scientific training could not explain the physical evidence that accompanied these supernatural encounters. The sudden temperature drops that could be measured on thermometers, the unexplained sounds that multiple witnesses confirmed, and the strange marks found in the earth around places where the spirits had been sighted. As the phenomena intensified, a terrible question began to form in the minds of Millersburg's residents. Were the Sinclair sisters trying to warn the town about something, or were they responsible for the Whitmore daughters' disappearance? If you were experiencing these supernatural visitations, would you try to communicate with the spirits, or would you flee the town entirely? On October 20th, 1872, a stranger arrived in Millersburg aboard the afternoon stage, carrying with her an aura of mystery that seemed to part the very air around her. Madame Cordelia Blackwood presented herself as a medium and spiritual advisor, claiming to have traveled from Louisville after receiving what she called psychic impressions of the tragedy unfolding in the small farming community. Dressed in deep mourning attire despite claiming no recent bereavement, Madame Blackwood possessed an otherworldly presence that both fascinated and unsettled the townspeople. Her dark eyes seemed to see beyond the physical world, and when she spoke, her voice carried an authority that suggested intimate familiarity with realms most people could only imagine. She took rooms at the Millersburg Inn and immediately announced her intention to contact the spirits that were clearly disturbing the peace of the living. Sheriff McKinnon met with the medium that evening, his skepticism warring with his desperation to solve the case that had consumed his every waking moment. "I've dealt with charlatans before," he warned her bluntly, "and I have no patience for parlor tricks when 3 young lives hang in the balance." Madame Blackwood's response chilled him to the bone. "Sheriff, I can tell you things about this case that you haven't shared with anyone. The missing daughters didn't simply vanish. They were called away by forces that have been waiting 18 years for justice. The Sinclair sisters died with unfinished business, and now they've found their means of resolution." She proceeded to describe details about the disappearance that had not been made public, the damp nightgowns, the undisturbed locks, the single footprint by Miller's Creek. But more than that, she spoke of things that no living person could have known. The desperate final prayers of the dying Sinclair sisters, their promises to return if their family's memory was dishonored, and their growing awareness that someone had built prosperity on the graves of their grief. "The Whitmore daughters are not dead," Madame Blackwood announced with certainty that brooked no argument. "But they are no longer entirely among the living either. They exist now in a space between worlds, held there by spirits who seek acknowledgement of past wrongs and proper burial for old sins." That night, against Sheriff McKinnon's better judgment, Madame Blackwood conducts her first séance in the parlor of the Millersburg Inn. Town leaders gathered around her table as candles flickered and shadows danced on the walls. When she called upon the spirits of the Sinclair sisters to make their presence known, the temperature in the room dropped so dramatically that frost formed on the windows, and every person present heard the unmistakable sound of 3 young women weeping with inconsolable sorrow. The medium had made contact, but what the spirits demanded in exchange for the return of the Whitmore daughters would test the very soul of Millersburg. The séance that followed would be remembered by its witnesses as the most terrifying night of their lives. As Madame Blackwood entered her trance state, her voice gradually transformed, becoming higher and more musical. taking on the cadence and inflection of a young woman from a different era entirely. When she finally spoke, it was with the voice of Margaret Sinclair, the eldest of the deceased sisters. "We have waited so long in the cold earth," the spirit said through the medium's lips, her words accompanied by a wind that should not have been possible inside the closed room. 18 years we have watched our home desecrated, our memory erased, our very existence denied. The man who built his fortune on our graves never spoke our names, never honored our sacrifice, never acknowledged that we once lived and loved and died on that sacred ground. The assembled townspeople sat frozen in their chairs as the temperature continued to drop, their breath forming visible clouds in the supernatural chill. Sheriff McKinnon tried to speak, but found his voice trapped in his throat, as if invisible fingers had closed around his windpipe. "We do not wish harm to the living daughters," Margaret's spirit continued, "but we cannot rest while our story remains untold. They are with us now, in the space between life and death, safe but not free. They understand our sorrow, for they too are daughters who loved their father, daughters who would sacrifice themselves for family honor." Through Madame Blackwood, the spirit of Catherine Sinclair then spoke, her voice younger and filled with an ache of unfulfilled dreams. "Show them our photographs," she pleaded. "Let the world see our faces, know our names. Remember that we lived with dignity and died with grace. We were not just victims of disease. We were daughters, sisters, young women with hopes and desires that were cut short by tragedy." Finally, Sarah Sinclair's spirit emerged, the youngest sister whose voice carried the heartbreaking innocence of childhood lost. "Tell our story truly," she whispered, "and we will return what was taken. But if our demands are ignored, if we are forgotten once again, then 3 shall become 6, and the living daughters will join us in eternal watching until justice is finally served." The séance ended abruptly when every candle in the room extinguished simultaneously, plunging the gathering into complete darkness. When light was finally restored, Madame Blackwood sat slumped in her chair, completely drained by the spiritual contact. But clutched in her unconscious hand was a daguerreotype photograph that had not been there moments before. An image of 3 beautiful young women in white dresses, their eyes filled with the same desperate longing that witnesses had seen in their supernatural appearances. The spirits had made their demands clear, but would the town of Millersburg find the courage to meet them? In the grey dawn following the séance, the town leaders gathered in emergency session to consider the impossible choice laid before them. The photograph materialized during the spiritual contact showed the Sinclair sisters in their earthly beauty, their faces radiant with youth and hope, making their current plight all the more heartbreaking. Madame Blackwood, still weak from her supernatural ordeal, explained the precise terms of the bargain the spirits demanded. "They want recognition," she said, her voice hoarse from channeling otherworldly voices. "Not revenge, but remembrance. The Sinclair sisters died believing their sacrifice meant something, that their devotion to their parents would be honored by future generations. Instead, their story was buried along with their bodies, their home destroyed, and their very existence erased from local memory." The spirits' demands were specific and non-negotiable. First, the town must erect a proper monument to the Sinclair family in the cemetery, acknowledging their sacrifice during the cholera outbreak. Second, the true history of the 1854 epidemic must be recorded and preserved, ensuring that the sisters' story would never again be forgotten. Third, and most importantly, Samuel Whitmore must publicly confess his deception and ask forgiveness for building his prosperity on their unmarked graves. Only when these conditions are met, Madame Blackwood continued, will they release their hold on the living daughters. The Whitmore girls exist now in a liminal state, caught between worlds, experiencing the same isolation and abandonment that the Sinclair sisters have endured for 18 years. Mayor Cornelius Ashford, a practical man who had built his political career on avoiding controversy, struggled to comprehend the supernatural nature of their crisis. "You're asking us to believe that 3 dead girls have somehow kidnapped 3 living ones, and the only ransom they want is a monument and a history lesson?" But Professor Whitman, who had spent days researching the cholera outbreak, understood the deeper psychological truth behind the spirits' demands. "It's not about monuments or history books," he said quietly. "It's about justice. The Sinclair sisters gave their lives caring for others during the worst crisis our town ever faced. They deserve to be remembered as heroes, but instead they became inconvenient ghosts whose memory was deliberately suppressed for the sake of commerce and progress." As the men debated the practicality of negotiating with the dead, reports arrived of new supernatural phenomena throughout the town. 3 figures in white had been seen walking through the streets at midnight, visiting every house and business, their presence accompanied by an overwhelming sense of grief that left witnesses weeping uncontrollably. The spirits were making their power known, demonstrating that they could affect every life in Millersburg until their demands were satisfied. The town faced an unprecedented choice: acknowledge the injustices of the past, or lose 3 innocent daughters to the realm of the dead. Time was running short, and the spirit's patience was clearly waning. On the morning of October 23, 1872, the entire population of Millersburg gathered in the town square to witness an event unprecedented in their community's history. Samuel Whitmore stood before his neighbors, clutching the land deeds and legal documents that represented his life's deception, prepared to confess sins that had cost him everything he held dear. The crowd that assembled was unlike any seen before in the quiet farming town. Word of the supernatural crisis had spread throughout the county, drawing curious onlookers, newspaper reporters, and even a few traveling ministers who hoped to witness what they called a divine reckoning. But for the residents of Millersburg, this was no spectacle. It was a desperate attempt to save 3 innocent lives through the power of public confession. Samuel's voice trembled as he began to speak, his weathered face etched with the terrible weight of 18 years' deception. "My friends and neighbors, I stand before you today as a man who has built his life upon a foundation of lies. The prosperity you have seen in my family, the success of my farm, the very ground upon which my house stands, all of it was gained through dishonor and concealment." He held up the yellow documents for all to see, his hands shaking with emotion. "I purchased my land not from the territorial government, but from the estate of the Sinclair family who died during the cholera outbreak of 1854. I bought their tragedy at a discount price and then spent years erasing every trace of their existence from that sacred ground." The confession continued with painful detail as Samuel described his systematic destruction of the Sinclair homestead, the relocation of their family cemetery, and his deliberate suppression of their story. "I told myself I was creating a fresh start for my family, but the truth is that I was stealing from the dead. I built my daughter's happiness on top of another family's grief, and now they are paying the price for my greed." As Samuel spoke, witnesses later reported that the very air around him seemed to shimmer with supernatural presence. The autumn wind carried sounds that resembled feminine voices whispering words of forgiveness, and several people claimed to see translucent figures standing at the edges of the crowd, listening with expressions of profound relief. "I beg the spirits of Margaret, Catherine, and Sarah Sinclair to accept my confession and forgive my sins," Samuel concluded, tears streaming down his face. "I ask the people of this town to remember their sacrifice and honor their memory. And I pray that my own daughters will be returned to me, though I know I no longer deserve their love or respect." The public confession was complete, but would it be enough to satisfy the demands of the restless dead and secure the release of the Whitmore daughters from their supernatural captivity? Within hours of Samuel Whitmore's confession, the town council voted unanimously to commission a monument honoring the Sinclair family's sacrifice during the cholera epidemic. Mayor Ashford, despite his earlier skepticism about supernatural matters, recognized that the community's very survival might depend on their willingness to right the wrongs of the past. The task of designing and creating the memorial fell to Marcus Steinberg, a German stonemason whose family had immigrated to Kentucky following the failed revolutions of 1848. Steinberg was known throughout the region for his skill in carving elaborate tombstones and monuments, but he had never before been asked to create a memorial for the purpose of appeasing restless spirits. Working with Professor Whitman and the church records, Steinberg designed a monument that would tell the complete story of the Sinclair family tragedy. The centerpiece would be a tall granite obelisk bearing the names and ages of all 5 family members, surrounded by 3 smaller headstones dedicated specifically to the daughters who had sacrificed their lives in service to others. But as construction began in the cemetery, strange phenomena accompanied every stage of the work. Tools would be found rearranged each morning in patterns that seemed to suggest corrections or improvements to the design. The granite blocks, quarried from the nearby Kentucky River region, arrived bearing natural markings that resembled angelic figures, as if the stone itself had been chosen by supernatural hands. Most remarkable of all was the discovery made when workers began excavating the foundation for the monument. 3 feet below the surface, they uncovered a collection of personal items that had clearly belonged to the Sinclair sisters. A silver locket containing miniature portraits of their parents, a leather-bound diary filled with pressed flowers and poetry, and a small wooden cross carved with initials that matched the sisters' names. Madame Blackwood, who had remained in town to monitor the spiritual situation, examined these artifacts with great interest. "These were buried with love," she announced, placed in the earth as a memorial when the sisters died. Someone in 1854 wanted to ensure that their memory would endure even if their graves were lost to time. Further investigation revealed that Dr. Marcus Webb, the physician who had attended the Sinclair family during their final days, had secretly buried these mementos after their deaths. His own journal, discovered in the town archives, described his conviction that the sisters deserved a memorial that would outlast the temporary markers placed on their graves. As the monument took shape, witnesses reported a gradual change in the supernatural atmosphere surrounding Millersburg. The temperature drops became less severe, the mysterious sounds grew fainter, and the apparitions of the 3 sisters appeared less frequently. It seemed that the spirits were responding positively to the community's efforts to honor their memory and acknowledge their sacrifice. But the most important test still lay ahead. Would the completion of the monument be enough to secure the release of the missing Whitmore daughters? Professor Ezra Whitman had never faced a more challenging assignment than creating a complete and accurate historical record of the 1854 cholera outbreak, with particular emphasis on the heroic sacrifice of the Sinclair sisters. Working day and night in his cramped study, surrounded by towers of yellowing documents and fading photographs, he labored to resurrect a story that had been deliberately buried beneath decades of willful forgetting. The research revealed details that painted the Sinclair sisters in an even more heroic light than the spirits had claimed. Contemporary newspaper accounts, previously overlooked in the town archives, described how Margaret, Catherine, and Sarah had volunteered to help Dr. Webb care for other cholera victims, even after their own parents had fallen ill. The sisters had transformed their farmhouse into a makeshift hospital, using their own bedding and supplies to comfort dying neighbors who had no other source of care. "They were angels of mercy in human form," wrote Dr. Webb in a journal entry dated October 10, 1854. When other families fled in terror, the Sinclair daughters opened their doors to the afflicted. They fed the hungry, comforted the dying, and prepared bodies for burial when undertakers refused to enter contaminated homes. Their courage in the face of certain death puts my own medical training to shame. Even more moving were the personal letters Professor Whitman discovered in the effects of families who had died during the epidemic. Several parents had written final messages praising the Sinclair sisters for their kindness during their children's last hours. One mother described how Catherine Sinclair had sung lullabies to her fevering son throughout his final night, providing comfort that no medicine could match. The historical record also revealed the true scope of the epidemic's impact on Millersburg. Of the town's population of approximately 800, nearly 200 had died during the 6-week outbreak. The Sinclair sisters had personally cared for at least 40 victims, many of whom might have died alone and forgotten without their intervention. As Professor Whitman compiled this information into a comprehensive historical account, he made arrangements for its preservation in multiple forms. Copies would be placed in the town archives, the State Historical Society, and the Library of the University of Kentucky. The story would also be published in regional newspapers, ensuring that the Sinclair sisters' sacrifice would be remembered far beyond the borders of their small community. But the most important aspect of his work was not its scholarly merit, but its spiritual significance. Each fact uncovered, each act of heroism documented, seemed to provide comfort to the restless spirits who had waited so long for recognition. The supernatural phenomena that had plagued the town began to diminish as the historical record took shape, suggesting that truth itself possessed the power to heal wounds that had festered for nearly 2 decades. The spirit's second demand was being fulfilled, but the fate of the Whitmore daughters still hung in the balance. As October drew toward its end, the supernatural tension that had gripped Millersburg for weeks began to show signs of easing. The oppressive atmosphere that had made every breath feel labored started to lift, replaced by something that residents could only describe as a sense of peace, slowly settling over their community like morning mist on quiet fields. Madame Blackwood reported that her psychic impressions of the Sinclair sisters had changed dramatically. Where once she had sensed overwhelming grief and desperate urgency, she now perceived something approaching contentment. "They are still present," she explained to Sheriff McKinnon during one of their daily consultations, "but their emotional state has transformed from anguish to anticipation. They are watching our efforts with what I can only describe as cautious hope." The physical manifestations of supernatural activity became more subtle but somehow more meaningful. Instead of the frightening apparitions that had terrorized townspeople, witnesses now reported glimpses of 3 young women in white standing peacefully in the cemetery, their faces turned toward the rising monument with expressions of profound gratitude. Their presence no longer brought fear, but rather a sense of solemn blessing that moved even the most skeptical observers. Most encouraging of all was the discovery made by Timothy Fletcher, the same young man who had found the mysterious footprint by Miller's Creek weeks earlier. While helping with construction of the monument, he noticed 3 sets of small handprints pressed into the wet mortar around the base, as if unseen hands had touched the stone in blessing. The prints appeared to be those of young women, and their placement formed a perfect triangle around the memorial, a sign that the spirits approved of the community's efforts. Jeremiah Hastings, who had been monitoring the health effects of the supernatural crisis, reported that the epidemic of insomnia and nervous exhaustion that had plagued the town was beginning to subside. Families were sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks, and the nightmares featuring the Sinclair sisters had been replaced by dreams of a more comforting nature. Visions of 3 young women walking hand in hand toward a bright light, their faces finally at peace. Even the children of Millersburg, who had been most sensitive to the spiritual disturbances, began to show signs of improvement. Their frightened reports of ghostly playmates were replaced by accounts of friendly spirits who waved goodbye from the cemetery gates, as if preparing to depart for a better realm. But the crucial test remained. Would the spirits fulfill their promise to return the Whitmore daughters when all their demands had been satisfied? As the monument neared completion and Professor Whitman put the finishing touches on his historical account, the entire town held its breath in anticipation of the supernatural bargain's final resolution. The spirits had shown their approval, but would they honor their word? The answer would come with the rising of the next sun. October 30th, 1872, dawned crisp and clear as the finishing touches were applied to the Sinclair family monument. Marcus Steinberg had worked through the night by lantern light, guided by an inexplicable sense of urgency that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. As the sun crested the horizon, casting long shadows across the cemetery, the German craftsman stepped back to admire what he would later describe as the finest work of his career. The monument stood 8 feet tall, its polished granite surface reflecting the morning light like a beacon of remembrance. At its peak sat a carved angel with wings spread wide, her face turned heavenward with an expression of serene acceptance. Below, inscribed in letters deep enough to last for centuries, were the names of Josiah and Mary Sinclair, followed by their 3 daughters, with dates that told their tragic story in stark numerals. But it was the inscription at the base that would move visitors for generations to come. In memory of Margaret, Catherine, and Sarah Sinclair, aged 17, 15, and 13, who gave their lives in service to their community during the cholera epidemic of 1854. Their sacrifice transformed tragedy into nobility, and their courage lights the path for all who follow. They shall not be forgotten. As the final words were carved into the stone, witnesses reported a phenomenon that defied natural explanation. The autumn air, which had been perfectly still moments before, began to move in gentle spirals around the monument. The wind carried what sounded like distant voices singing hymns of thanksgiving, and several observers claimed to see 3 translucent figures standing beside the memorial, their hands pressed to their hearts in gestures of profound gratitude. Professor Whitman arrived at noon with the completed historical record, bound in leather and sealed with wax to ensure its preservation. As he placed the document in a specially constructed vault at the monument's base, the sensation of spiritual presence became so strong that every person in the cemetery felt it like a physical touch upon their souls. The temperature began to rise noticeably, not with the oppressive heat of summer, but with the gentle warmth of a loving embrace. The supernatural chill that had plagued Millersburg for weeks finally dissipated completely, replaced by an atmosphere of peace and resolution that made the very air seem lighter. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the cemetery, Madame Blackwood announced that she could sense the Sinclair sisters preparing to depart. Their earthly business was finally complete, their story preserved, and the sacrifice acknowledged by the community they had died to protect. The spirits were ready to release their hold on the living and accept the eternal rest that had been denied them for so long. But first, they had a promise to keep: the return of 3 innocent daughters who had been caught in the web of supernatural justice. As darkness fell on October 30th, the entire population of Millersburg gathered in the town square to await the fulfillment of the spirit's promise. Samuel Whitmore stood at the center of the crowd, his face etched with the strain of weeks spent in limbo between hope and despair. Sheriff McKinnon had positioned himself nearby, though his rational mind still struggled to accept that law enforcement could extend into the realm of the supernatural. Madame Blackwood served as the evening's spiritual guide, her psychic senses attuned to the otherworldly forces that would soon determine the fate of 3 missing daughters. As the clock tower chimed 11, she announced that the final phase of the supernatural drama was about to begin. "The veil between worlds is at its thinnest," she explained, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed crowd. "The Sinclair sisters have prepared a passage for the return journey, but we must all maintain absolute silence. Any disruption could trap the living daughters between realms permanently." The air grew thick with anticipation as midnight approached. A gentle phosphorescent glow began to emanate from the direction of the cemetery, growing brighter with each passing moment. The light was not harsh or frightening, but rather possessed the soft quality of starlight reflected on still water. As it intensified, 3 figures became visible walking slowly down the main street toward the town square. Margaret Catherine and Sarah Sinclair appeared exactly as they had in the daguerreotype photograph materialized during the séance, but now their faces radiated peace instead of desperate longing. They moved with serene grace, their white dresses flowing around them as if stirred by celestial breezes. Between them, supported gently on either side, walked 3 other figures. The missing Whitmore daughters, alive and unharmed, but moving with the dreamlike quality of sleepwalkers. The supernatural procession reached the town square as the clock struck midnight. For a moment that seemed to last an eternity. The 6 young women stood together in the center of the gathering, creating a tableau of impossible beauty. The Sinclair sisters turned their faces toward the completed monument, visible in the distance, and smiled with expressions of infinite gratitude. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the 3 spirits began to fade like morning mist touched by sunlight. Their forms grew translucent, then transparent, until only their voices remained, 3 sweet harmonies singing a hymn of thanksgiving that brought tears to every eye in the crowd. When the ghostly music finally faded into silence, the Whitmore daughters stood alone in the square, blinking in confusion as if awakening from the deepest sleep of their lives. Samuel rushed forward to embrace them, weeping with relief and joy that threatened to overwhelm his capacity for speech. The supernatural crisis was over. The dead had kept their promise, and the living were free to resume their interrupted lives. In the days following their miraculous return, the Whitmore daughters slowly recovered their ability to speak about their extraordinary experience. What they revealed challenged every assumption about the nature of death, memory, and the bonds that tie the living to the departed. Their account, carefully recorded by Professor Whitman for historical posterity, provided insight into a realm that few mortals had ever glimpsed. Margaret Whitmore, the eldest at 17, spoke first, her voice soft with wonder rather than trauma. "We were not frightened," she insisted, despite her father's expectations of terrible stories. The Sinclair sisters were gentle with us, almost motherly in their care. They explained that we were needed to bear witness to their story, to understand the injustice they had suffered, and help them find peace. The missing weeks had passed like moments for the three sisters. They described existing in a twilight realm where time flowed differently, where the boundaries between past and present dissolved into a single continuous experience. They had witnessed the cholera epidemic of 1854, as if they were there, watching the Sinclair sisters care for the dying with boundless compassion, even as their own strength failed. "We felt their loneliness," Catherine Whitmore explained, her 15-year-old face bearing a maturity that hadn't been there before their disappearance. 18 years of being forgotten, of having their sacrifice ignored, of watching their memory fade while others prospered on their graves. They didn't want revenge, they just wanted someone to remember that they had lived and loved and died with purpose. Young Sarah, only 13, provided perhaps the most touching details of their supernatural sojourn. They showed us how to tend the sick, how to comfort the dying, how to find courage when everything seems hopeless. They were our teachers, showing us what it means to serve others even when it costs everything you have. The daughters described the realm between worlds as neither heaven nor hell, but rather a place of waiting where spirits lingered when earthly matters remained unresolved. The Sinclair sisters had created a sanctuary there, a space of beauty and peace where souls could rest while working toward their final resolution. Most remarkably, the Whitmore daughters reported that they had never felt truly captive during their time with the spirits. "They asked our permission before king us," Margaret revealed. "They explained what they needed and why, and we agreed to help because we understood their pain. We are daughters too. We know what it means to love your family so much that you would sacrifice anything for them." The supernatural experience had changed all three sisters in subtle but profound ways. They spoke with wisdom beyond their years, displayed extraordinary empathy for others' suffering, and seemed to possess an unshakable faith that love could conquer even death itself. Their testimony provided the final piece of the puzzle, confirming that justice and mercy could coexist even in the realm of the supernatural. The resolution of the supernatural crisis marked the beginning of a profound transformation in Millersburg that would echo through generations. The community that had once been content to forget uncomfortable truths about its past now embraced the power of memory and the importance of honoring those who had sacrificed for the common good. The Sinclair Monument became more than just a memorial. It evolved into a pilgrimage site that drew visitors from across Kentucky and beyond. People came to pay their respects to three young women whose courage had transcended death itself, and many left convinced that they had experienced something miraculous in the presence of the memorial. Fresh flowers appeared daily at its base, left by anonymous admirers who felt moved to honor the sisters' sacrifice. Professor Whitman's historical account was published in newspapers throughout the region, sparking a broader conversation about the hidden stories of heroism that lay buried in every community's past. Other towns began examining their own records for forgotten heroes, leading to a renaissance of historical preservation that scholars would later credit with saving countless important stories from oblivion. But perhaps the most significant change occurred in the people themselves. Samuel Whitmore, humbled by his public confession and the supernatural consequences of his deception, became an advocate for historical truth and community transparency. He donated a portion of his land to create a memorial park around the Sinclair Monument, ensuring that future generations would have a place to remember and reflect on the past. The Whitmore daughters, forever changed by their supernatural experience, dedicated themselves to caring for others in ways that echoed the Sinclair sisters' example. Margaret trained as a nurse, Catherine became a teacher, and Sarah grew up to establish an orphanage for children left homeless by disease and disaster. Their lives became living monuments to the lesson they had learned in the realm between worlds, that true nobility comes from service to others, even at great personal cost. Sheriff McKinnon, despite his initial skepticism about supernatural matters, became a believer in the power of justice that transcends the grave. He instituted new procedures for investigating unsolved cases, paying particular attention to stories that had been dismissed or forgotten by previous authorities. His conviction that every victim deserved justice, regardless of how much time had passed, made him legendary throughout the region. Even Madame Blackwood chose to remain in Millersburg, establishing herself as a spiritual counselor who helped other families resolve conflicts with the departed. Her success in mediating between the living and the dead attracted clients from as far away as Louisville and Cincinnati, bringing prosperity to the town while maintaining its reputation as a place where supernatural justice could be found. The crisis that had threatened to destroy Millersburg had instead revealed its capacity for redemption and growth. The town had learned that confronting painful truths, no matter how buried, was the only path to genuine peace and prosperity. While the supernatural crisis had been resolved and the Whitmore daughter safely returned, several mysteries continued to puzzle those who had witnessed the extraordinary events. These lingering questions would provide material for speculation and debate among Millersburg residents for decades to come, adding layers of intrigue to an already remarkable story. The first mystery concerned the exact nature of the realm where the Whitmore daughters had spent their missing weeks. Their descriptions of a twilight space between life and death suggested the existence of spiritual dimensions that challenged conventional religious understanding. Several local ministers struggled to reconcile the sisters' account with traditional theological doctrine, leading to heated debates about the nature of the afterlife and the possibility of communication between the living and the dead. Professor Whitman discovered additional puzzling details while researching the historical record. The cholera epidemic of 1854 had claimed many victims throughout the county, yet only the Sinclair sisters had demonstrated the ability to return from beyond the grave. What made their situation unique? Was it their extraordinary sacrifice, their violent denial from memory, or some combination of factors that had bound them to the earthly realm? Even more intriguing was the question of how the spirits had possessed the power to transport 3 living daughters into their supernatural realm. Madame Blackwood theorized that extreme emotional states could create psychic bridges between worlds, but she admitted that the mechanism remained beyond her understanding. The fact that the transportation occurred without physical violence or apparent coercion suggested spiritual laws that operated according to principles unknown to mortal science. The daguerreotype photograph that had materialized during the séance presented another mystery. Analysis by experts from Louisville confirmed that the image was authentic, not a forgery or manipulation. Yet no photographer in the region had any record of taking portraits of the Sinclair sisters. The photograph appeared to show them exactly as they had looked in life, captured by some supernatural means that preserved their earthly appearance for posterity. Perhaps most puzzling of all was the question of whether other restless spirits might exist in the area, waiting for their own stories to be acknowledged and their own injustices to be addressed. Strange phenomena continued to be reported occasionally in Millersburg. Unexplained sounds, mysterious appearances, and dreams that seemed too vivid to be mere imagination. Were these isolated incidents, or evidence that the Sinclair sisters' successful resolution had inspired other departed souls to seek their own justice? Dr. Jeremiah Hastings documented several cases of townspeople who claimed to have prophetic dreams following the supernatural crisis, as if their exposure to otherworldly forces had enhanced their psychic sensitivity. Whether these abilities were temporary or permanent remained to be seen, but they suggested that the boundary between the living and the dead had been permanently altered in Millersburg. These mysteries served as reminders that some aspects of existence would always remain beyond human comprehension, no matter how rational and scientific society became. 1 year after the supernatural crisis that had transformed their community, the people of Millersburg prepared to commemorate the first anniversary of what they had come to call the Night of Return. October 30th, 1873 arrived with the same crisp autumn air that had marked the resolution of the previous year's extraordinary events, and the entire town gathered at the Sinclair Monument to pay their respects and reflect on the lessons they had learned. The monument itself had weathered its first year beautifully, the granite stone maintaining its polished finish despite exposure to Kentucky's variable weather. More remarkably, the fresh flowers that appeared dyed lie at its base had never withered or faded, remaining as vibrant and beautiful as the day they were placed there. This phenomenon had attracted the attention of botanists and naturalists, though none could provide a scientific explanation for the perpetual blooms. Samuel Whitmore stood before the memorial with his 3 daughters, all of whom had flourished in the year since their supernatural experience. Margaret had completed her nursing training and was already known throughout the county for her exceptional skill in caring for the sick. Catherine had begun teaching at the local school, where her patience and wisdom made her beloved by students and parents alike. Sarah, though still young, had shown remarkable maturity and compassion, often visiting elderly residents to provide comfort and assistance. As the anniversary ceremony began, Professor Whitman read from his historical account, now published in book form and distributed throughout the state. The story of the Sinclair sisters had become required reading in Kentucky schools, ensuring that their sacrifice would never again be forgotten. Several universities had established scholarship programs in their honor, supporting young women who demonstrated exceptional dedication to serving others. But the most moving part of the ceremony came when the Whitmore daughters themselves spoke about their supernatural experience and its lasting impact on their lives. They described how their time in the realm between worlds had given them a profound understanding of life's interconnectedness and the importance of remembering those who had gone before. The Sinclair sisters taught us that death is not the end of love or responsibility, Margaret explained to the gathered crowd. They showed us that the bonds between generations cannot be broken by time or mortality, and that justice delayed is not justice denied if we have the courage to face the truth. As evening fell and the ceremony concluded, witnesses reported the familiar sensation of spiritual presence surrounding the monument. But now, instead of the desperate urgency that had characterized the previous year's supernatural manifestations, the feeling was one of peaceful blessing and eternal gratitude. The spirits of the Sinclair sisters had found their rest, but their influence on the living continued to grow stronger with each passing day, ensuring that their legacy of sacrifice and service would inspire future generations. News of the supernatural events in Millersburg spread far beyond Kentucky's borders, carried by newspaper accounts, traveling ministers, and curious investigators who came to study what scholars were calling the most thoroughly documented case of spirit communication in American history. The story resonated particularly strongly in other small communities where forgotten tragedies and buried injustices might be creating their own supernatural tensions. The Louisville Courier published a series of investigative articles examining similar disappearances throughout the Ohio River Valley, uncovering patterns of missing persons cases that had never been properly resolved. Several communities reported their own unexplained phenomena, mysterious apparitions, unexplained sounds, and dreams that seemed to carry messages from the dead. While none matched the dramatic scale of the Millersburg crisis, they suggested that the boundary between the living and the departed was more porous than most people had realized. Academic institutions began sending researchers to study the Millersburg case, leading to the establishment of the first American university program dedicated to supernatural phenomena and their psychological effects. The University of Kentucky created a special archive for collecting and preserving accounts of similar events, recognizing that these stories represented an important aspect of American folk culture that deserved serious scholarly attention. Religious communities struggled to incorporate the Millersburg events into their theological frameworks. Some denominations embraced the story as evidence of divine justice working through supernatural means, while others rejected it as dangerous dabbling in occult matters. The debate sparked a broader conversation about the nature of the afterlife and the possibility of communication between the living and the dead, leading to significant theological developments in several Protestant denominations. Perhaps most significantly, the Millersburg case inspired a movement toward historical preservation and community memory throughout the American frontier. Towns across the expanding nation began examining their own records for forgotten heroes and buried tragedies, leading to the discovery of countless stories of sacrifice and courage that had been lost to time. Memorial monuments sprouted in communities from Ohio to Oregon, each one representing a local effort to ensure that important stories would not be forgotten. The legal implications were equally profound. Several states began reviewing old, unsolved cases, particularly those involving suspicious disappearances or unexplained deaths. While supernatural evidence was not admissible in courts of law, the renewed interest in forgotten cases led to the resolution of numerous crimes that had been abandoned by previous generations of law enforcement officials. Medical professionals took particular interest in the psychological aspects of the case, studying how entire communities could experience shared supernatural phenomena. The research contributed to early understanding of collective psychology and the power of shared belief systems to influence perception and behavior. The Millersburg case had proven that individual acts of courage and sacrifice could echo across generations, inspiring others to examine their own community's hidden histories and work toward justice for those who had been forgotten by time. 25 years after the supernatural crisis that had defined his life, Samuel Whitmore sat in his farmhouse parlor, now filled with grandchildren who gathered eagerly to hear the story that had made their family famous throughout Kentucky and beyond. The old farmer, his hair now completely white but his mind still sharp, had become the unofficial keeper of the Sinclair sisters' memory, ensuring that their story would be passed down through generations of his own family. The Whitmore farm itself had been transformed into something approaching a shrine. Visitors from across the country came to see the place where the supernatural events had unfolded, and Samuel had created a small museum in his barn displaying artifacts from the cholera epidemic, photographs of the Sinclair sisters, and copies of all the historical documents that had been uncovered during the investigation. The admission fees helped support the memorial park that surrounded the Sinclair monument, ensuring its perpetual maintenance. His 3 daughters had each achieved remarkable success in their chosen fields, their supernatural experience having instilled in them a sense of purpose that drove them to extraordinary accomplishments. Margaret had become one of Kentucky's most respected nurses, pioneering new techniques for caring for epidemic victims and training a generation of medical professionals in the art of compassionate care. Her work had saved countless lives during subsequent cholera and influenza outbreaks. Catherine had revolutionized education in their region, developing teaching methods that emphasized empathy, historical understanding, and community service. Her students went on to become leaders in their own communities, carrying forward the lessons of courage and sacrifice they had learned in her classroom. The Catherine Whitmore Academy, established in her honor, continued to produce graduates who dedicated themselves to public service. Sarah, the youngest, had fulfilled her childhood calling by establishing a network of orphanages and care facilities for children left homeless by disease, poverty, and family tragedy. Her work had provided hope and opportunity for hundreds of young people who might otherwise have been forgotten by society. The Sarah Whitmore Foundation had grown to encompass facilities in 6 states, all guided by her philosophy that every child deserved love, education, and the chance to contribute meaningfully to their community. But perhaps the most important aspect of the Whitmore legacy was the family's unwavering commitment to truth-telling and historical preservation. They had established an annual scholarship for young historians dedicated to uncovering forgotten stories of courage and sacrifice, ensuring that future generations would have the tools and motivation to prevent important memories from being lost to time. Samuel's grandchildren listened with rapt attention as he recounted the events that had shaped their family's destiny, understanding that they carried a responsibility to continue the work of remembrance and justice that had begun with the Sinclair sisters' supernatural intervention. The story would live on, passed from generation to generation, a testament to the power of love to transcend even death itself. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Millersburg supernatural crisis had become a landmark case in the emerging field of paranormal research. Scientists, spiritualists, and investigators from universities across the nation had descended upon the small Kentucky town to study what many considered the most well-documented supernatural event in American history. Their findings would influence the development of psychical research for decades to come. Dr. William James, the renowned Harvard psychologist and philosopher, spent several weeks in Millersburg during the summer of 1897, interviewing surviving witnesses and examining the physical evidence that remained from the 1872 events. His aid, Subsequent paper, published in the American Journal of Psychology, concluded that the case represented either an unprecedented example of mass hallucination or compelling evidence for the survival of human consciousness beyond bodily death. The Society for Psychical Research, headquartered in London, sent a team of investigators led by the distinguished scholar Frederick Myers to conduct a comprehensive study of the Millersburg phenomena. Their report, published in 1899, documented numerous instances of ongoing supernatural activity in the area, including unexplained temperature fluctuations around the Sinclair Monument, mysterious photographic anomalies, and continued sightings of 3 female figures in white clothing. Perhaps most intriguingly, the investigators discovered that the supernatural sensitivity that had affected many Millersburg residents during the original crisis had not entirely faded with time. Several families reported that children born after 1872 displayed unusual psychic abilities, including prophetic dreams, the ability to communicate with deceased relatives, and an uncanny talent for locating lost objects or missing persons. These gifts seemed to be concentrated in families who had been present during the night of return, suggesting that exposure to intense supernatural forces had created lasting changes in the community's psychic atmosphere. The monument itself continued to exhibit properties that defied scientific explanation. Flowers left at its base remained fresh for weeks beyond their natural lifespan, metal objects placed near the stone became slightly magnetized, and photographs taken of the memorial often revealed unexplained light phenomena that did not appear to the naked eye. Several visitors reported experiencing profound spiritual experiences while standing near the monument, including visions of the Sinclair sisters and feelings of overwhelming peace and forgiveness. Modern technology brought new tools to bear on the mystery. Early experiments with electromagnetic detection equipment revealed unusual energy fields surrounding the monument that fluctuated in patterns that seemed almost rhythmic, as if responding to some unseen intelligence. Temperature measurements confirmed that the air around the memorial remained consistently several degrees cooler than the surrounding area, regardless of weather conditions or season. These ongoing phenomena suggested that the resolution of the original supernatural crisis had not completely severed the connection between the living world and whatever realm the Sinclair sisters now inhabited. Instead, it appeared that Millersburg had become a permanent gateway between dimensions, a place where the boundary between life and death remained perpetually thin. As the 20th century progressed and scientific understanding of the world expanded exponentially, the Millersburg case continued to challenge researchers, theologians, and philosophers who sought to understand the nature of consciousness, survival after death, and the mysterious forces that seemed to govern human destiny. The questions raised by the supernatural events of 1872 proved to be as relevant in the modern age as they had been in the aftermath of the original crisis. Psychologists studying the case focused on the phenomenon of collective spiritual experience, trying to understand how an entire community could share supernatural perceptions with such remarkable consistency. The fact that multiple independent witnesses had reported identical visions, sounds, and other paranormal phenomena suggested that the events could not be dismissed as simple hallucination or psychological suggestion. Yet the mechanisms by which such shared experiences could occur remained beyond the reach of conventional science. Theologians from various denominations continued to debate the spiritual implications of the Millersburg events. The Gayken story of the Sinclair sisters challenged traditional concepts of divine justice, suggesting that God might work through supernatural means to address earthly injustices that human institutions had failed to resolve. Some religious scholars embraced this interpretation, arguing that the case demonstrated the active presence of divine justice in human affairs. Others worried that accepting supernatural intervention might undermine faith in established religious doctrine and ecclesiastical authority. Philosophers grappled with the ethical questions raised by the spirit's methods of seeking justice. Was it morally acceptable for the dead to compel the living to acknowledge past wrongs, even if no direct harm was intended? Did the Sinclair sisters have the right to transport the Whitmore daughters into their supernatural realm even with their consent? These questions touched on fundamental issues of agency, consent, and the relationship between individual rights and collective responsibilities that extended across generations. Modern parapsychologists attempted to develop scientific models that could account for the various phenomena documented in the Millersburg case. They proposed theories involving residual psychic energy, interdimensional communication, and the possibility that intense emotional experiences could leave permanent impressions on physical locations. While these theories remained largely speculative, they represented serious attempts by trained scientists to address phenomena that clearly fell outside the boundaries of conventional physics and biology. Perhaps most importantly, the Millersburg case continued to inspire individuals and communities to examine their own histories for forgotten stories of courage, sacrifice, and injustice. The lesson that the dead could return to demand acknowledgement of their contributions had profound implications for how societies should treat their historical records and memorialize those who had served the common good. The questions raised by the Sinclair sisters' supernatural intervention remained as compelling and mysterious as ever, ensuring that their story would continue to provoke thought and debate for generations to come. Some truths, it seemed, transcended the boundaries of any single era or scientific paradigm. Today, more than a century and a half after 3 farm daughters vanished into the realm between worlds, the Sinclair monument still stands in the Millersburg Cemetery, weathered by time but unbroken in its vigil over the past. The granite angel atop the memorial continues to gaze heavenward with serene acceptance, her stone features bearing witness to the enduring power of love, sacrifice, and the human need for remembrance. Visitors who come to pay their respects often report experiences that echo the supernatural phenomena of 1872. Fresh flowers still appear daily at the monument's base, left by anonymous admirers who feel compelled to honor 3 young women they never knew but whose story has touched their hearts across the centuries. The flowers remain vibrant far longer than nature should allow, as if blessed by some gentle force that preserves beauty as a tribute to lives cut short but not forgotten. The Whitmore family farm, now owned by distant relatives who maintain it as a historical site, continues to draw pilgrims from around the world. They come seeking answers to eternal questions about life, death, and the mysterious forces that bind us to those who have gone before. Many leave convinced that they have encountered something miraculous, carrying with them a renewed faith in the possibility that love truly can conquer death. The town of Millersburg itself has evolved into a center for historical preservation and supernatural research, its economy sustained in part by the steady stream of visitors who come to study the most thoroughly documented case of spirit communication in American history. The local library houses one of the nation's most comprehensive collections of paranormal research, while the Sinclair Museum displays artifacts from the 1872 crisis alongside accounts of similar phenomena from around the world. But perhaps the most important legacy of the supernatural crisis lies not in the tourism it generates or the scholarly research it continues to inspire, but in the simple truth it revealed about the power of memory and acknowledgement to heal wounds that time alone cannot touch. The story of the Sinclair sisters stands as eternal testimony to the importance of honoring those who sacrifice themselves for others, regardless of how much time has passed or how convenient it might be to forget their contributions. As shadows lengthen across the Kentucky hills each evening, and autumn mist rises from the valleys where 3 young women once walked in service to their community, the spirits of Margaret, Catherine, and Sarah Sinclair continue their eternal watch over the living. They remind us all that some bonds transcend mortality, that justice delayed is not justice denied, and that the dead will never truly rest until their stories are told and their sacrifices remembered. The mystery endures, the questions remain, and somewhere in the space between worlds, 3 sisters smile in eternal gratitude that their love proved stronger than death itself. What do you believe happened to the Whitmore daughters during their time in the realm between worlds? Share your theory in the comments below, and remember to honor those in your own community whose sacrifices may have been forgotten by time.